Now, just again, how this is going to work. I'm going to ask all of the contributors just some real quick questions to get things started. And then again, start putting your questions, comments, whatever it is you want to say in the questions and answers box. And as soon as I've gone through basically my first round of kind of quick questions, I will try and get to those. And so I'll start with Corey. Maybe Corey, you could give us a quick overview of why we put this book together. And then maybe the main points of your chapter that dispels the myth that because children aren't widgets, we cannot leave education up to free market. So Corey, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Neal. That's a lot to talk about, but yeah, there's a lot of good reasons to write this book, and I'm just happy it came out at this time where school choice is more important than ever. It's one thing for the schools to fail to educate children adequately each and every year for decades for many families. It's another conversation altogether for the schools to retain children's education funding regardless of whether they even open their doors for in-person instruction. And we've seen so many public schools fighting to remain closed during the past couple of months, where we've seen the private sector have a different response. And if you look at the data from Brown University, private schools have been more likely to reopen in person. Private daycares, private grocery stores, and restaurants, they've either been fighting to reopen or they've been open for a long time. Public schools, in large part, have been fighting for the opposite. And I think it's because of a difference in incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of how well it meets the needs of their customers. And in this case, regardless of whether they open the doors. One quick note in how I define school choice that I want everybody to kind of think about is it's more about, instead of just school choice, I like to talk about it more in terms of what it actually is, which is funding students instead of institutions, just like we do with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives. For higher education, for example, we have Pell Grants in the GI Bill. The funding goes to the student, and the student can choose to take that money to a public or private university of their choosing. We do the same thing with state-funded and federally funded pre-K programs. The money goes to the family, and the family can rightfully choose to take that money to a public or private provider of pre-K services. You can go on and on and on with these examples: food stamps, Medicaid, Section 8 housing vouchers. All of these other initiatives fund the person instead of the building. And a lot of the people who support these other initiatives that fund people instead of institutions don't support funding students directly when it comes to K-12 education. So I started to think a lot about, well, why would you support funding people directly when it came to higher education and pre-K, but then not when it comes to the in-between years? And the only thing that I can think of is that there's a difference in power dynamics. The norm when it comes to higher education and pre-K and groceries and restaurants and all of these other industries is that you already have a high degree of choice. The norm in K-12 education is that you have an entrenched interest that profits off of getting your children's education dollars, regardless of whether your family is satisfied with that product and regardless of whether the family even decides to choose to send their child to that particular institution. And so since there's a difference in power dynamics, I think that's why we have people that are arguably logically inconsistent in supporting one over the other. So we have a ton of myths that arise in the debate in order to fight to protect that monopoly at the expense of individual families. And so we go over 12 of the biggest myths in this debate in this book. If we went over all the myths, we'd probably have a 2,000-page book. That would just be too long to do. We'd have to get 50 invited authors, but we only stuck to 12 because of page limitations. And my myth was that the argument goes that children are not widgets, so education shouldn't be left to the market. My quick response is that, well, that's true, but because children aren't widgets, education shouldn't be left to the government. Because children have unique individual needs, they should be allowed to sort, and the funding should follow the child to the institution that works best for them. One size doesn't fit all, and that's why school choice is a better solution to the reality that children aren't widgets. I would like to hit on another myth from Ben Scafferty, though, if you give me a second, Neal. Is that okay?
Well, sure, why not?
I'll do it really quickly.
It's kind of crazy. Go ahead.
It's the biggest myth in the debate, so we can't go forward without hitting it. Is everybody says that, well, a lot of people on the other side will say that school choice defunds public schools, to which I respond, school choice does not defund public schools. Public schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return that money to the hands of the rightful owners, and you can still take it back to the public school if you want, but the money doesn't belong to the public school. You would similarly never hear someone say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Safeway. Everybody would see that that would be absolutely ridiculous to say that, because your grocery money doesn't belong to Safeway. It doesn't belong to Walmart. It doesn't belong to any particular institution. It belongs to the family. Similarly, K through 12 education funding is supposed to be about educating the child. It's not supposed to be about protecting and propping up a government monopoly. So our education funding should reflect our priorities and the reality that the funding is meant for the child and not the institution. And the second response to that is that, well, if you believe that the public schools are doing a good job, why would giving families an option defund the public schools? And I'll let everybody think about why that may be. But let's go to the next person. Talked too much already.
All right. Well, thanks for channeling Ben Scafferty.
And Marty Lucan was also on that chapter as well.
That's right. I wish we could have everybody, but we're probably already overfilled this. So I want to get to Phil, though. Phil, one of my biggest pet peeves is, well, sort of channeled in one book, who I'm sure you know, Steve Suits at Emory University. I think you've written about his book. He has a book out called Overturning Brown, The Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement, which essentially says school choice was born of segregation, and in segregation it remains. Based on your chapter, I'm guessing that you might have a few things to say about that proposition.
Absolutely. So this was an interesting project I took on, because I had been working in the history of school choice, especially in the state of Virginia, which was kind of a hotbed back in the 1950s and early 1960s of the resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. And what we've seen over the past, I'd say 4 or 5 years, is a new talking point that's emerged among school choice critics, where they claim that school choice itself was basically invented as this way to circumvent the Brown versus Board desegregation ruling the Supreme Court issued in 1954. So it's kind of a genetic argument that all of the teachers unions and usual suspects that are opposing school choice now call upon. And the idea is that they can claim that the origin of school choice is tainted. Therefore, anyone who advocates it today is following the legacy of Brown versus Board, is involved in segregation, is supporting basically something that derives from segregation, which is rather silly as an argument, not only as a logical fallacy, but based on the evidence that's actually mustered in its favor. And what happens if you actually dig deep into the history of school choice, you find really 3 things are going on. First, school choice predates Brown versus Board as an idea by almost 150 years. You can find origins of it in the writings of Adam Smith in the late 18th century, Thomas Paine in the early 19th century, John Stuart Mill in the mid 19th century. So their basic origin story that they're using in this talking point is completely wrong. The second issue that comes up is during the Brown versus Board era, although the people that use this talking point claim that school voucher advocates were aligned with segregationists, it turns out that the major school voucher organizations in the United States tended to mostly be from the northern states. They were aligned with religious schools, in particular Catholic schools. And you can go back into the archives of these organizations, which I've done, and you find that they're to a T, they are all anti-segregation. They are all very concerned about the use of vouchers to move students from a desegregated public school into a segregated private school. And in fact, one of the largest groups that was active at this time filed several amicus briefs before the Supreme Court, arguing explicitly that vouchers should be excluded from segregated institutions. So it turns out that the voucher advocates themselves were actually on the right side of history at the time. And the third point, and this is what's really eye-opening, when you dig into the records, particularly in Virginia, you find that a lot of the anti-voucher activists at the time, which were the same interest groups that we see today, teachers unions, such as the state chapter in Virginia of the NEA, actually forged a political alliance with the segregationists to try and defeat school vouchers that were being advocated at the time. The one case that came out of Virginia, I found all these documents from attorneys who litigated the anti-segregation lawsuits on the segregationist side, and they were claiming, quote, that school vouchers will lead to the Negro engulfment of the public schools, because it turns out if you open up schools to movement of students, people get to choose which school they go to, and African Americans would move into schools that they were trying to use all these legal maneuvers to keep them out of. So it turns out that this whole narrative, this myth of school choice being aligned with segregation, falters on all of its three main claims: both the historical origin, what the voucher groups were actually doing in the 1950s and 60s, and what the segregationists who aligned with the anti-voucher groups were doing in the 1950s and 60s.
Great. And it's probably also worth mentioning the idea of school choice goes far further back than Brown v. Board, right? I mean, we're talking about
Absolutely.
people in the 18th century, in early American history, with Catholics wanting school choice because the public schools were de facto Protestant. I mean, there's a whole lot in this chapter that people can really wade into. I'm going to go now to Albert. You may know, if you have the book, that now I'm following the chapter order again, as promised. So Albert, you wrote a chapter about the myth that school choice only helps the rich get richer, which has always struck me as one of the odder myths, but one that we hear a lot. Can you explain really quickly what the thinking behind that myth is, and then feel free to expound at length on why that's wrong?
Yeah, Neil. So this myth's actually been around for several years now. The earliest mention of this, you could find in the 90s, even during that time. And essentially, the myth goes like this. So sure, let's have school choice. Let's give scholarships or vouchers to low-income families. Well, the fact of the matter is private school tuition is still out of reach for these families because the voucher doesn't cover enough of the expenses. And so what happens is poor families still get left out of participating in school choice programs, while wealthy families also who get these scholarships and vouchers basically get their private school tuition subsidized, right? And so in the aggregate, in the end, what you end up with is a school choice being a program that subsidizes the wealthy, those who can actually access private schools in the first place, and then still leaves behind families without the means to cover the expenses of private school. Now, I guess to tackle this, mention a couple things in the chapter that I wrote. One, I think it's important to note before we even address this myth in particular, is the fact that A, we actually do have school choice now, and B, we actually have a form of school choice that actually makes the rich richer. Namely, and this form of choice is the classic school choice by mortgage, right? By assigning families to particular district-run schools based on where they live. That's a form of choice. It's a form of choice not exercised by paying tuition dollars, but it's a form of choice that people exercise by taking out large mortgages or spending a fortune on nice homes and nice areas of certain communities. And so who does that kind of choice benefit? Well, it's the wealthier who can afford a nice home in the better, more affluent part of town that has better schools and places that are more amenable to raising property taxes to spend more fund, increase school funding. Well, who gets left out in that kind of arrangement that we have today? Well, it's the poor and folks that don't have the means to purchase a home in a neighborhood that gives them access to that kind of school. So I think one thing is clear here, that yes, school choice can make the rich richer if you're talking about school choice by mortgage, which is the system that we have now. Now, if we're going to talk about private school choice or different other forms of school choice that have nothing to do with residential assignment, my argument is that actually that does not make the rich richer. One of the easiest ways to start thinking about this, arguing why this is not the case, is to simply take a look at all the school choice programs we have throughout the country. So I think a lot of you are familiar with EdChoice's ABCs of school choice, right? Great guide that lists all the different kinds of programs that exist throughout the country. And so I actually took a detailed look at that in my chapter. And I found that over about three quarters of the programs that exist are basically geared and there for low-income families or families that have kids with special needs, right? Hardly a program that's some kind of regressive welfare for affluent families. There's other programs there where eligibility is a little more universal, but by and large, the majority of programs that exist are there for families who fall below some threshold of the federal poverty line, or families that have students with special needs. The other thing I'll mention in brief here is that in some of my own work in surveying parents, we specifically asked, if parents struggled with the issue of not being able to participate in school choice programs because private school tuition would still be out of reach even if they got the voucher or the scholarship or some subsidy. It turns out, based on the parent survey work that I've done, that's actually not a concern shared by a lot of parents. I think it was only like 2% of parents who said that was an issue. Now, look, I mean, let's be honest here. I think we in the school choice space, education leaders can do better at expanding access. But this myth that private school choice makes the rich richer because the poor, in spite of getting a voucher or some subsidy, still can't access private schools, is something that's just not borne out in the data.
Great, thanks, Albert. I'll just remind people who may have just joined us, we're talking about the book, School Choice Myths. I'm talking with several contributors. Also, I encourage you, if you have questions or just comments you want us to deal with, you can go in the questions and answers tab. You'll see it in the chat or on the question answer button, and you can just leave whatever comments. Hopefully they're not too insulting, but comments or questions that you have. I'm next going to go to Lindsey. Now, Lindsey, you and Jason Bedrick of EdChoice tackled a topic I know can ignite sort of heated debates even among the people gathered here at EdPalooza. So I'd like you to go ahead and light this fire. What can you tell us about the proposition that school choice needs regulation to ensure access and quality?
Yeah, thanks, Neal. So that is the title of our chapter. So Jason Bedrick of EdChoice and I wrote this chapter. We were delighted to contribute to the book, delighted to be on the panel today, because it remains a huge issue, even within, as Neal said, the school choice community. And debate over school choice, despite that, is still largely portrayed as a debate between those who support free market reforms and those who oppose them. But what Jason and I walk through in this chapter is that the reality is much more complicated than that. Supporters are ideologically diverse. They range from those who support a free market, minimally regulated choice environment to what we outline as equalitarians, who believe that guaranteeing access to a quality education requires substantial government intervention. And the equalitarians, as we outline in this book, they effectively argue that without regulations, choice could even hurt low-income families. And so we walk through exactly what their arguments are and then try to demonstrate why some of those arguments don't work out the way that proponents hope they do in reality. And so we first put forward a framework about what those regulations look like. And so if you sort of listen to the equalitarian argument for regulating school choice, they will say that to hedge against perceived inequalities created through systems of choice, that 4 specific regulations at a minimum are needed to govern these school choice programs. So first, they will say government must intervene to ensure that private schools enroll disadvantaged children. And so that manifests itself often as open enrollment policies on participating private schools. Next, they argue that even if guaranteed admission to a private school, choice is meaningless without the ability to pay for it. So they will argue in favor of prohibiting private schools that accept vouchers from charging families more than the value of that voucher. And so then they'll say, well, third, even if guaranteed a fully subsidized seat at a school, that choice lacks value if the available options are of low quality. So then they'll require, or then they will argue that states should require private schools that participate to be accredited. And then finally, they say, well, because accreditation is insufficient in and of itself to guarantee quality, standardized testing is needed. And so often we see this in the form of requirements for private schools to take to administer a standardized test to participating children, or even all children in the private school. That often looks like a single state standardized test. And sometimes that even means tying program participation to the outcomes on that single state standardized test. And so Jason and I walk through this framework, and then we take the opportunity in the chapter to do a quick case study of two states that have very different regulatory environments. The first is often talked about in our Ed Choice circles, and that is Louisiana. So the Louisiana Scholarship Program, we note, has all of the equalitarians' recommended regulations. They have open admissions requirements, they put price controls on their program, they require private schools to be accredited, and there's even a state testing mandate with associated consequences for poor performance. Now take Florida. Florida is the other state that we highlight. Let's contrast Florida's regulatory environment with that of Louisiana. Florida has none of the equalitarians' recommended regulations. Schools set their own admissions procedures. Parents can top off their child's scholarship amount. They do not have to be accredited, and private schools can choose any nationally norm reference test they want to administer to their students. So these are two very different regulatory environments that have led to two very different outcomes for participating students in those states. Just quickly, we look at Louisiana, we can see that in participation numbers and academic outcomes, we have very different outcomes than in Florida based on enrollment numbers and outcomes. So in Louisiana, we now have about 1,700 participating children in the voucher program in the state. That's great, but it's only about 1% of the overall student public school population. Compare that to Florida, which now has 107,000 students participating in its scholarship program, which represents about 4% of their overall public school population. Yes, Louisiana's scholarship program helps students from low-income families up to $65,000 for a family of four. That's the income cap. But in Florida, where the income cap is similar, they have done a phenomenal job at ensuring the lowest income children have access to that program. The average family income in Florida is $25,000 for participating families. So we have two different participation groups in those states. And what do we see in terms of outcomes? Louisiana, we've all talked about it many times, worse outcomes for participating children in the voucher program. This was a shock to the school choice community when this came out a couple of years ago. We have two randomized controlled trial evaluations now that have found that students who participate in the Louisiana Scholarship Program actually performed worse, significantly worse, in math and reading than their peers who wanted to participate but did not participate. Now contrast that with Florida. Participants outscore their demographic groups nationally, and participation has actually increased college enrollment 17 points for students who are in the program at least 4 years. And so Neal, I'll hand it back to you, but I will just say quickly that what does all of this mean? Differences don't prove that a free market in education is necessarily superior to a heavily regulated market. We can't do randomized controlled trial evaluations between Louisiana and Florida, so we can't draw causal connections, but it does demonstrate that regulations are not necessary to achieve equalitarian ends, greater access to higher quality schools.
Great, thanks, Lindsey. I hope Virginia will be able to join us. I never know the severity of anybody's technical problems. If it's like the ones I often, except I see her connecting now. So I may have spoken just in time. But while we wait, because technology can be dicey, I'm going to go to the first question that we have in the question and answers. I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to answer it on the panel. Just to raise your hand, I'll call on you. And then just a reminder, if you have a question or a comment, you can put it in that question, and I think it says question and answers as the name of that button down in your chat box. And I think another one just came in, so it threw me off. But so our first question is from Anna. She says, what is your advice for states or districts looking to implement a choice-based school system to increase equity in school assignment? Albert, that may be best to start with you. But then anybody else who wants to chime in, just let me know. But Albert, I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Yeah, it is a hot seat because I don't know what kind of advice. I'm scrounging around for some advice, and I don't know that I have any off the top of my head. But I don't know, perhaps to maybe spur some other discussion. So I don't know if this. I guess I take it that this question is probably. It sounds like this is an effort that someone wants to try out. I guess all I can say is I'm all for it. I'm kind of one of those folks that don't care what choice looks like. I think we can actually even talk about school choice in less of a zero-sum game approach and try to unleash build all sorts of institutions that basically open up choice for more families. So, if states and districts want to try to use existing institutions like the, I guess this sounds like something within a city, perhaps. I'm all for it. Improving educational outcomes for kids. That's an all hands on deck type approach, and let's all roll up our sleeves and do what we can in our own spheres.
Right. I'll plug another chapter in here. Again, we're talking about school choice myths, new book available at fine booksellers everywhere. But Matt Ladner has a chapter in here that talks a lot about Arizona, and sort of piggybacking on what Albert said, they kind of adopted an all hands on deck approach where they have private school choice, they have charter schools, but they have lots of school districts embracing intra-district choice. And so Arizona's been able to achieve some pretty remarkable outcomes without spending a whole lot of money. And his thesis in the book is that this is because choice has become something that's been more than just private school choice or charters. It's sort of the whole ecosystem in Arizona. I don't know whether anybody has anything they want to add to that. If not, we can move on because I do have some other questions coming in. So this is from Nikki. Says, what are your suggestions for policymakers in states entrenched in the power dynamic that Corey discussed in the beginning of the presentation? Would you recommend even a small portion of our dollars be named to the child to carry out resources that would meet the needs of the child even now during the pandemic? They say the UK is developing a tutor corps to address the learning loss during the pandemic. I haven't heard of any such efforts as this here in America. Those individual dollars would help. So there's a lot in there. The tutor corps is something I've heard a lot about, is people talking about, this might be a good way to put recent college graduates who are having trouble getting a job, put them to work. What do you think about that and this power dynamic issue? And maybe Corey, you should go first, since it was about your discussion.
Yeah, I will say in the states where you don't have much of a problem with union influence and people who might not vote in favor of school choice, a way to push forward with school choice is to not alienate conservatives as much when we're pushing for school choice. So it's good to make all arguments on all fronts of the battle for school choice, make the equity arguments, make the arguments that it'll improve the public school system, but also make the arguments about political indoctrination that could be happening in the classroom so that you don't lose the base of conservatives who would otherwise vote to push for school choice policies. If you don't mobilize the conservatives, then you might not get school choice even in red states. and then you end up with the status quo. But when we're talking about states that do have more union influence, Lindsey and I have actually thought a little bit about how to push the ball forward on this. We did a random assignment study using a survey experiment in California, for example, and we randomly assigned a deregulation in the public school and kind of a benefit alongside school choice to try to get people who wouldn't support school choice before to be more likely to support it. We found essentially no deregulation made any difference for the other side to support school choice. So before our results came in, I would have said maybe try to work into the bill some type of benefit for the traditional public schools, but it's school choice is so alienating for so many people in the traditional system that regardless of what you do to make their jobs easier in the traditional system, they're probably not going to support school choice. But another thing to do is to maybe create a financial benefit for the public schools while creating a financial benefit for the taxpayers as well, which is how school choice bills are already written. So, the way that we currently do this is we tie the per pupil funding amount in the voucher program as a percentage of what would have been spent in the public schools. This creates a benefit for taxpayers and the public schools too, but you still have people in the public school system fighting against that as well, even though they financially benefit when they lose students to school choice programs. They actually end up with more money on a per pupil basis than before because schools aren't completely funded based on enrollment counts.
And of course, that's in Ben Scafferty and Marty Lucan's chapter in great depth. So again, in the book, you'll get a good unpacking of that. Corey, did I interrupt? Sorry about that.
No, and I just wanted to hit on that first question for a second. I mean, one way to get towards more equality is just to get rid of residential assignment altogether. Why are we residentially assigned to schools? It doesn't make any sense. We don't residentially assign low-income families using food stamps to government-run grocery stores. We don't residentially assign people to colleges. We don't residentially assign people to restaurants. We don't do that with essentially anything else. Even with public parks, you can walk to the public park that you like, that you think is what you'd prefer on one day of the week or the other. The public schools don't seem to be public in any meaningful sense of the word. If you look at it this way, like you would with a public park, because of this zip code based discrimination, your zip code shouldn't determine your school and your future. So why don't we just get rid of it? And I think the most equitable way to go forward with school choice is if we can't get that all together, is to just fund the students directly with an education savings account and to allow them to customize their children's education like advantaged families are already able to do. Advantaged families can already pay for private school tuition and fees out of pocket. They can already afford to group together with these pandemic pods and micro schools. Why don't we allow all families to do that by funding the students directly? I think that's the best way to ensure increased access to equitable educational services.
I just say, if you're lazy like me, you drive to the public park. You don't walk. But I get your point.
Well, I'm in DC, so we have a lot of public parks right around. But you're in the DC area too, Neal. Maybe, but you're not right in the middle, I guess.
Yeah, but like I said, if you're lazy like me, you drive to the public park. Anyway, so anybody else have anything they want to add to that? I mean, there's a lot going on in that question. If not, I've got one that I think is especially for Lindsey. But Lindsey, did you want to add to this other one? I mean, to what Corey just discussed?
Well, I was just going to say, Corey brings up a good point. This question of how do we bring more policymakers along? I think one caution to throw out would be, when thinking about potential incentives for district schools to get on board, right? The incentive for the McDonald's to say that they want a Burger King in their neighborhood, whatever it might be. It's difficult to do. And in DC, you can see a pretty good example of that. The DC voucher program, which is a fantastic scholarship program for low-income students in the district, has been life-changing for kids, increased significantly their academic outcomes, college enrollment rates. They are safer, they're happier, their parents are happier. Been a fantastic program. But if you look at one measure we often look at, which is competitive effects, we don't see it in DC to the extent many would like. So part of the reason probably is that the district system receives additional funding as a result of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. And so that may have put a little bit of downward pressure on those competitive effects that we would otherwise want to see in a really robust private school choice program to also lead to improvements in the public system as well, in addition to improvements for students who exercise private school choice.
All right, I'm going to
Yeah,
get.
hey, Neal, can I add something else? I guess
Sure, go ahead.
Of the UK developing a tutor corps, and there's nothing like that here in the States. I'd also encourage folks to be entrepreneurial here. The pandemic has thrown everything, all of us for a loop. But also, these are opportunities to innovate and create something new. We've talked much about these days about all these pandemic pods that are arising. None of this is like driven by some policymaker legislating something. It's done by people actually just coming together with their neighbors to build something new. And what I've noticed, I think, is that the fact that you have people at the grassroots level coming together to build a new possibility, that actually gives policymakers, opens them up to a new possibility, right? I'm sure some policymakers probably don't even know of these great ideas that exist out there. Let's not wait for them to come to that revelation. We can kind of nudge them along by being imaginative ourselves and building stuff on our own, building our own institutions, and maybe that just creates some critical mass later on, and who knows, that gets institutionalized in a broader sense, policy-wise, perhaps.
That's a great point. We always forget something called civil society, or basically everything that exists between the family and government as a way you can do things. But Phil, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in, I guess, a historical anecdote that has actually strikingly created some parallels with what we're seeing today with the coronavirus shutdowns, although very different mechanism. So one of the things I touched on in my chapter, and I've since explored quite a bit, was the school closure movement that happened in the 1950s in the wake of Brown versus Board across the South, where a lot of state legislatures basically came in and they shut down their public schools to prevent the federal courts from ordering them to integrate. So the idea is you get rid of public schools, the court can't order you to integrate them anymore, and that was their way of preserving segregation. But a lot of what happened in that era is the voucher movement was not an alliance with the segregationists. It was rather parents that were displaced by these awful policies coming up with innovative and alternative means of getting their kids to school. And you actually find that a lot of the parents that supported the integration in some of the southern states were going to the northern-based voucher advocacy groups and saying, "Hey, can you help us? Can you get a network set up here, or can you allow us to move our children into private schools, in particular Catholic schools, which tended to be integrated at a much earlier stage?" So you have a history of vouchers not only being used in the present day as a mechanism to get around some of the awfulness and some of the problems of the public school system, but there's also precedent in this going back to previous crises where public officials actually obstructed the delivery of the project of education. So I just urge everyone to think about this. We are not in new territory here. We can actually learn quite a bit from some of these lessons of the past.
Thanks. Now, Glenn, I've got your question here, but I'm really ecstatic because Virginia is with us. I can see the tech problem exasperation on your face, which I get pretty much every time I turn on a computer or try and operate a phone or even a vacuum cleaner. I often find it's just too much for me. So I'm just going to ask Virginia if you could just tell us a little bit about your chapter, and because it really deals with, I think, one of the most irritating, aggravating, and ridiculous arguments against school choice. We framed it as basically only the rich can make good choices for their kids. But the converse of that is the idea that poor people just couldn't possibly make a reasonable choice for their kids. And I mean, you have been in this by longer than anybody here on the ground. What'd you write in your chapter about what you've observed about this myth?
Okay, I'm having trouble here, but we're gonna get this right in a minute. Well, my chapter certainly is about parent empowerment and all the myths that go along with parents not being able to have the sense or the resources or the intelligence to choose schools for their children. It was an amazing chapter to write, actually. Took me back to a lot of meetings and events where parents were so incredibly articulate and eloquent about their needs for their children. So we saw during many, many years of working with parents that the myth that parents can't choose for their schools for their children is just absolutely ridiculous. So it was I went back to a lot of those events and a lot of those conversations with parents who oftentimes gave me amazing lists about what they wanted for their children, things that a lot of the experts don't even think about. You know, these are parents that spend a lot of time thinking about what they want for their children and their feelings about their children's education. So it was a great chapter to write, you know, because I got to rethink and relook at all of those myths and look at how ridiculous they are once again, and you know, talk to parents, think about the conversations I had with parents about making choices for their children.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. This is going to be an unexpected question, but if I recall from your chapter, didn't you have some examples even of parents who sort of having the ability to choose help them sort of, I can't remember the exact anecdote, but there was somebody, a parent who was having a lot of trouble in their own lives, but sort of it sounded like got their life better together because they could care for their kids and were empowered to help their kids.
I'm really happy. There were really a lot of conversations. You know, one particular conversation was one story that I always remember and I think about often is the parent that came in with a 2-page list of things she wanted for her child, and it was an amazing list. And she showed it to me, and we talked about it prior to the event starting. And once it got started, I noticed that she wasn't saying anything, and so I ask her, you know, you need to share your list with the rest of the group. And for her, it was difficult because she didn't read, but she had gotten somebody to help her put this list together and to make sure that nothing was left out. And these were her thoughts and what she wanted for her child, and somebody else had written them down. And so she and I got together and we presented that list, and there were many oohs and ahs in the rooms because those were things that people wanted for their children. So it was always really amazing to me to hear what their desires for their children are and were and are, continue to be. And because those are the things that people don't believe, that parents that are not educated or are from low income and or minority situations don't understand, but they understand better than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Can I just build on that for a second? Because Virginia brings up an incredibly profound point about how frequently we see a mismatch between what policymakers think families need and what parents actually want for their own children. And so often this is the problem with heavy-handed regulations that close down a school because, you know, academic performance on a single state standardized test isn't sufficient in the eyes of the regulator. And yet the reason a family might select that school is, you know, so numerous, right? It could be school safety. It could be because the teacher smiles at the child and knows his name. All of these intangible things that don't necessarily get captured on a single state standardized test. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind what Virginia brought up, that we need to wield that regulatory pen with humility when it's taken out or if it's taken out at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, one parent told me at one point or another that what she wanted was for her child to be safe, and she didn't feel like he was safe in his school. And every time she took him to school, she hoped that nothing would happen. And so safety was a big priority in a lot of their minds. But also, as Lindsey said, a smile. People that acted like they cared about their child. You know, even myself going into a private school with my son, the first thing I saw when I walked in the door were people smiling and welcoming us there. And sometimes that's what you need to make sure or believe that your child will get a better have a better situation and get a better education. So there are a lot of things that, you know, that we look at other than what the research is. One of the questions I get is about test results. You know, most of the parents that I worked with initially didn't know anything about test results. I mean, they couldn't look at the paper and read the scores or results because it had not been something they had been given that information about. So that wasn't the first choice for them. The first choice for them was, I heard that school was good, quote unquote. and over time, they would learn how to understand test results and how to read them and everything. But that wasn't the first thing on their mind. The first thing on their mind were so many other more human things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I won't go too much into my chapter, and actually this isn't really the nucleus of my chapter, but I talk a little about a Horace Mann. I deal with this idea that the public schools unify us, but it's really more about, as I've read a lot of Horace Mann, you start to realize that there's a lot of well-intended arrogance almost behind public schooling, where people who think they're very well educated and think they're very smart, think they have all the answers that other people don't, and they think it's almost like their duty to impose that on people. If you read Horace Mann, you get that very clearly. Basically, a lot of parents didn't understand the science of phrenology and things like that, which of course now we know is bunk, but might have been cutting edge for him. And he condemned parents, saying, well, they don't even know this cutting edge science. And there seemed to be sort of this lack of humility of, well, what if I'm wrong? No, I couldn't be wrong because I have the right bumps in my head.
Right.
In any event, so it puts me off on a tangent, but it really is a part of this. And it sort of goes to this question that we got from Glenn that I've been haven't gotten to very quickly. Anybody who wants can answer it. But he says, questions about accountability. He says, is there accountability in private schools, homeschools, or charters versus the sort of accountability in traditional public schools? You've all sort of talked about it, but what's the difference if somebody really wants to hit that home?
I guess everybody probably wants to answer. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Glenn Cordelli's given us a softball question. He knows the answer to this. The only form of true accountability comes from the bottom up, allowing people to vote with their feet to the institution that works best for them, just like we do with any other industry. When a charter school underperforms, it goes out of business. When a government-run school underperforms, it tends to get more money. The incentives are completely backwards when it comes to government-run monopoly school systems, where private schools and charter schools are directly accountable to the families. If they don't do a good job for them, families can take their money elsewhere and walk if the private and charter schools don't deliver. So I think that's the main difference. And let's stop talking about top-down testing regulations as a form of accountability. That's not a form of accountability. You're not going to regulate yourself to greatness. You don't see that in any other industry in the United States. Red tape never leads to higher quality. The only real form of accountability comes from the bottom up. You're never going to produce greatness through just more and more bureaucratic red tape. It's just not going to happen. And so, I mean, this is huge. It's a huge benefit having Lindsey on this panel because she wrote a whole chapter about it. I'm glad that her and Jason, really destroyed this myth. But a lot of the people who understand the argument that families have the best information and incentives to make the best decisions for their own children better than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away try to regulate the choices of low-income families when it comes to charter schools and private school choice programs. Do you believe in families' ability to make choices or not? And I think we should all be on the same page here, but we have some division in the school choice movement.
I'll let Lindsey go ahead. I think Lindsey wants to say. I will say, though, I mean, if you watched President Bush's interview today, you know that there's a lot of disagreement about this, that you've got to measure to know what you're getting. So clearly this is a hot topic. So Lindsey, go back to it. Aggravate some people.
Well, I was going to paraphrase Jason Bedrick, who I think has one of the pithiest, best definitions of accountability. And so Jason has said accountability means being directly answerable to those who will bear the consequences of your actions. And I think that's a great summation of what accountability means. And if we think about that, apply it to the public system, who is held accountable, to Corey's point, for these low academic outcomes? Who is held accountable in the public education system for the fact that only about a third of students across the country can read and do math proficiently? Who is held accountable for the fact that only 2 in 10 Americans can name a single branch of government? It's certainly no one in the district education system, the government-run education monopoly. Contrast that with private education options and charter school options. They are held directly accountable to their customer, which is the client. And if that client isn't happy, they can walk with their feet.
Absolutely.
All right. So I don't see any more question and answer in the question and answer area. We've probably only got about 5 minutes left, but I was reading something that may have popped up on your Google alerts. I did on mine a couple of hours ago, and I really want to get to it. There's a New York Times op-ed from Jack Schneider and Jennifer Berkshire. You may know those names. What's that?
They wrote a book about Patrick Wolf, didn't they?
They may have, because I'm about to mention Patrick Wolf. This is talking about undoing all Betsy DeVos's horrible policies, or actually horrible policies that she has somehow connected to. But they say 2 things that I want to deal with real fast. One, they say, we hope we can get back to supporting public education, which they really define as public schooling, which they call the bedrock of democracy. I talk a little bit about that in my chapter, but you definitely want to see Patrick Wolf's chapter, which lays out how very clearly the research shows that private schools have produced better citizens, more knowledgeable and more tolerant citizens than do the public schools. And so that goes directly to that idea over and over that public schools are the bedrock of our democracy. And again, that's a response to something that's sort of hot off the press. But the other thing that I think we didn't put as a myth, but I wish we had, and I think you probably all have something to say with it, is they call school choice a radical fringe idea. And I'm just sort of curious, do you all think that it is a radical fringe idea to have school choice?
It does make me wonder if they got assigned to their colleges.
Yeah, that would be a radical idea.
Right.
That'd be a radical idea to force people to spend their food stamps at government-run residentially assigned grocery stores. That would be radical.
Right.
Yeah, that would be. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I've always thought that was really ridiculous when people said that, because it's about parents making a choice what's best for their children. We are our children's first teachers, so we should be making the choices about how our children are educated. And if that's radical, then people have been radical for the ages, because we always made choices about how our children were raised. So to include where our children go to school makes more sense than anything else. They're being forced to go to schools where we know walking in the door that they're not going to do well. So, I think it's what we should be doing. And we've seen this more I've talked to more parents about making choices about where their kids are educated during the pandemic than ever before. And I love the conversations I'm having with people, because they go back to the way it should be versus those that think it's so radical for parents to be involved in making those choices for their children's education. I know of no child that has not done well if their parents chose a school where they were happy. Kids do well when the team, a parent and child, is together making a decision about how their child will be educated, whether it's a school or homeschooling or a virtual school, the online schools. It's a partnership that parents have with their children about how they're going to be educated, starting from little kids. When my daughter started first grade, she could read, and she could read because we learned how to read together, she and I. And I taught her how to read, and people were always so impressed by this little bitty kid who knew how to read as well as she did. But that was our team of Virginia and Maisha learned how to read. And I think that's what parents do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it strikes me as wishful thinking on the part of these two authors. If you look at the EdNext polling from this year, 2020, Albert, you might have worked on this. I can't remember if you did this year or last year, but there's either plurality or majority for school choice, depending on the way you're talking about it, whether it's charter schools or tax credits. And so when a plurality or majority of people say they want something, it's a little hard to say it's fringe, but I think this may be the myth we're about to confront a lot, which is that anybody who wants school choice must be a little bit crazy. I don't know how you all think about that, because that means you may all be a little crazy. But on that note,
crazy about defending the rights of families to choose their school. That's right.
Right.
That's right, Corey. We are very crazy about that.
Well, good. Well, then, I hope you're still crazy after all these years. I think that's Simon and Garfunkel, I just paraphrased. Anyway, so I think we're at the end now. I want to thank all the contributors to the book. I want to thank especially the contributors who are with us here. Of course, the book we've been discussing is School Choice Myths. You can find it on the Cato website. You can Google it. It's on Amazon, all your major places you buy books. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you very much.